Welcome to the Story Learning Podcast, regular doses of language learning tips and motivation to help you become fluent in any language. With me, Olly Richards. For language programs, books, free resources, and much more, visit StoryLearning.com. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the I Will Teach You a Language podcast. Thanks for joining me, and I feel like I should start by apologizing for the slightly erratic publishing schedule recently. It's been a bit of a tumultuous time with trips to Montreal and a couple of big projects that I've been working on, most notably the new Spanish beginners course, which has been a lot of fun and very well received, but a lot of work as well. That's also meant that the transcripts have suffered a little bit. Sometimes I have to make a decision between, do I get the podcast, if I record a new episode, do I get the podcast out now, or do I wait a few days for the transcript to come in? And more often than not, I decide to get the podcast out right away, so that those of you who've been waiting for an episode can indeed get it. So that's a little bit about that. You are witnessing my best efforts to get it back on track. So on that note, a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. We've got some great guests coming up on the podcast. In the next couple of episodes, you'll hear from Gabriel Weiner, who I'll be speaking to about his new app that he's creating, attempting to replace Anki, which is a bold claim. We'll ask him about that. Alex Rawlings is coming back on the podcast with a new book that he's published, which is called How to Learn Any Language, and it's full of really, really great advice. We've also got Dr. Stephen Krashen coming on the podcast, Stephen Krashen is one of the most well-known and celebrated applied linguists. Any of you who are teachers or who have studied teaching or second language acquisition or applied linguistics will know the name Dr. Stephen Krashen, so he'll be coming on, which is great. We have also quite a few new language resources on the way. We have a new book on beginner's French. So if you are thinking about learning French or you're in the early stages of French, well, I've got a new book that will be coming out that aims to give you all the most important things you need to know about learning French right at the beginning, all in one go, so you can kind of get it out the way, get all the important information on your radar so that you can make faster progress at the beginning. So I'm really excited about that. Be sure to email me if you're kind of jumping up and down right now thinking, I really want to get my hands on that book. Drop me an email to olly@iwillteachyoualanguage.com. I'll make sure you get information about that when it comes out. I'm also really creating a British Sign Language course, which is a bit of an experiment for me, but sign language is something that's been on my radar for a while now, and I've really wanted to learn more about it. So I'm creating a course. I've teamed up with a professional British Sign Language teacher, and we're creating a beginner's course so that if you do live in the UK or Ireland and you want to just learn the basics so you can start to communicate with deaf people, that will be coming very, very soon. I'll mention it on the podcast, I'm sure, whenever I do. Also, Conversations is only weeks away now. Conversations is something I've been mentioning for a while, and it's my long-term project. It's been going for almost a year now. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to create material that helps you improve your listening comprehension by creating compelling stories to listen and read to, along with transcripts and word lists and professionally recorded audio, and stories that have been specially written to help you upgrade your listening skills from that kind of post-beginner level to a point where you can actually understand native speakers when they're talking. So it's an awful lot of work. We're doing it in 6 languages: French, German, Italian, Spanish, Chinese, and Japanese. So we're working very hard at getting that ready. We've got some amazing illustrations. I spent the whole of last month actually recording here in London with 36 different voice artists, stroke native speakers, stroke newbies as well. So there's been a lot of work in the making, but I really hope that you will enjoy it when it comes. And I believe with that, it's probably time to get to today's question. All right then, without any further ado, because there's been quite a lot of ado so far, let's hear from today's questioner, Aaron.
Hello. How can I use a vocabulary book in the right way, I mean properly. For example, everybody says that you should categorize words according to the themes that they belong to. But I personally don't think that this is a useful way to learn new vocabulary. So, what are your suggestions for keeping a vocabulary notebook in the proper way?
Hi, Errol. Thank you very much for your question. And it's something which is on the minds of many learners, and also something that teachers often talk about as well. And you're in your question, you ask, what's the proper way? What's the most useful way? And that it very much does depend on you and what you find useful. But I can tell you about my experience with this. And, I have seen many learners go crazy with vocabulary notebooks. Having these big elaborate systems of writing down words and color coding things, organizing words by topic, and having these beautiful vocabulary notebooks that look amazing. And it does make you feel quite studious when you do that stuff, doesn't it? I mean, you feel like you're doing something good. But I mean, when I was a teacher, I would encourage people to keep vocabulary notebooks. But I have to say, I encouraged people to do that because that's kind of what teachers do, right? Now, as a learner, I look back on it and I kind of think, well, what was I doing? Because I don't do that as a learner myself. I don't keep these big vocabulary notebooks. When I look back at my learning in the past, I mean, yeah, I would write down tons of words in notebooks, and then you know what would happen? I would put the notebook back on the shelf and I would never look at it again, and it would just gather dust. I've got dozens of notebooks on the shelf full of verbs and vocabulary and nouns and phrases, whatever, all this different stuff that I've done, and I never look at it. I never go to one thing I never do is go to my bookshelf, take out a vocabulary notebook and study that vocabulary. I just don't do it. And so, when you ask this question, Errol, my first reaction is, well, what's the point of doing anything in a vocabulary notebook? And I think you have to ask yourself, first of all, and be honest and say, all right, let's say that I do keep an extensive vocabulary notebook. Do I trust myself to actually go back and look at it and study it? And in my case, the answer is no. I simply wouldn't do it. And I suspect for many of you listening as well, you're going to answer something similar. I think we like to think that we're studying seriously, and we like to think that we're being diligent. But it's really important to just think about what's the product and the outcome of keeping a vocabulary notebook like this. Do you actually do anything with it? You've got to ask yourself those questions. How valuable is the time that you're spending organizing a vocabulary notebook? Now, if you find that, writing down all these words, organizing them by topic, doing whatever it is you do, if you notice that as a result of doing that, you learn lots of words and your level in your language improves, then by all means, keep doing it. Absolutely. Don't let me tell you not to do it. But I would just encourage you to think back to all the time you have spent with a vocabulary notebook and ask yourself, what is the tangible value? How has it really helped me? Because if you don't go back and look at that book and you don't do things with those lists of words, then it's a waste of time, right? So will you ever look at it again? I remember when I was in working as a teacher, I would see teachers hand out these worksheets, and they would have it would be like a double side of A4 paper. And it would be you'd have to, first of all, write down the word in the language and then say, is it an adjective or an adverb or a noun or a preposition? And then write the dictionary definition and then 3 example sentences and then write a passage of creative writing using the word, all of this detail. And I think and I looked at that and I thought, that's a good idea. But that's like me doing busy work as a teacher, not thinking about it from the kind of learner's perspective. Now I've just come back from Montreal. I spent a lot of time talking with one of my favorite language thinkers, who is Steve Kaufman, and we spent a lot of time last weekend talking about this stuff. And I listened to his talks and all the various. Every time I sit down and talk to Steve, it makes me challenge my own thoughts and my own approach to language learning. And we spoke about something very interesting. And our conversation, you'll hear much more about this in the interview with Stephen Krashen coming up, but essentially our conversation was about, well, if you spend most of your time listening and reading, which is what Steve does when he learns a language, what proportion of unknown words should you have in your text? So let's imagine you're reading an article. How many of those words should be unknown? Now, Steve says that for him, he likes to read text where about 20% of the words are unknown. They're new for him. Now, for me, that's far too high. You can't make any progress. I can't make any progress through a text when 1 out of every 5 words is unknown. And I talked to Krashen about this, and he agreed. He said, yeah, for him it's like 5-10%. But Steve's reply was this. Steve said, well, if you don't read and listen to stuff that has a large amount of unknown vocabulary, how are you ever going to be able to cover enough new words to make progress in the language? In other words, if with your vocabulary notebook, you're spending so much time on individual words, how are you ever going to build up the large mass of vocabulary that you need to really learn a language? And I've been thinking about that a lot. Now, that doesn't answer the question of, okay, well, how do you learn this vocabulary then? But I think it does what that did was bring into perspective for me things like vocabulary notebooks and endless busy work around vocabulary notebooks, which don't contribute at all to you improving the level in your language. Now, I still am convinced that there is a very important place for memory techniques and conscious vocabulary learning for most people. I'm one of those people. I need that stuff, and most people that I meet need that stuff as well. But it's about balance, isn't it? And I think that if you said that, okay, you're spending 20-30 minutes a day creating a vocabulary notebook, I would rather spend that time actually consciously learning new vocabulary that I want to learn, not just writing it down on a piece of paper for the sake of it. So what do I recommend you do? Okay, here is what I suggest you do, Errol. First of all, number 1, you've got to get your new vocabulary from rich, compelling context. All right, which means reading and listening to things that you like and speaking with people that you enjoy speaking to. From all that activity, you take new vocabulary that you want to learn. Now, if you like to write that down in a notebook, jot it down quickly during your lesson or whatever, then by all means, write that down. I like to write things down because it just helps me repeat the word once more, But then what I do afterwards is I look through all the stuff I've written down and I take only the most useful words, and then having taken those useful words, I then put them through my process for learning vocabulary. All right, so that's conscious, active time spent memorizing vocabulary. But it's all come from, point number 1 is it's all come from rich, compelling context. And then point number 2 is I only choose the most important words that I want to learn right now. And then I spend time learning that. The vocabulary notebook doesn't really feature at all in there. It's just a way for me to write it down because I like writing things down. I know I'm not going to come back to it, so I don't spend any more time with it. All right, so I hope that helps. If you would like to ask me a question, please go to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/ask to do that. And at the end of every episode, I like to leave you with a resource of some kind on the topic of the show. So 2 things for you today. First of all, I have a video called Is Your Vocabulary Notebook Out of Control? And it's a popular video. It's got some 20,000 views or so on YouTube, and a lot of people have found it really useful. And I show you exactly what I do, this process of writing stuff down and then selecting the most useful vocabulary. If you'd like to have a look at that video, you can find it at iwillteachyoualanguage.com/episode 211. Those are the show notes for this episode. And also, in general, for learning vocabulary and how to, once you've written down these words, how to actually memorize them, then you should come and take my free email course, which I'm going to tell you about in just a second in the little outro reel. So definitely check that out if you haven't already. And that's a wrap for today. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode of the podcast.
Thanks for listening to today's episode, and in case you didn't already know, I teach languages in a rather unusual way through stories. Now, stories are a great way to learn a new language because when you're engrossed in a story, you remember things more easily, and the mechanics of the language just start clicking inside your brain. It's quite something, and if you'd like to find out how you can learn a new language or improve your skills in a language that you already know and do it with the power of stories, then you should check out my free Story Learning Kit, which will teach you exactly how this method works and how you can use it yourself to learn a new language. Visit storylearning.com/podkit, that's PODKIT, to get free access. Inside, you'll find explanatory videos, masterclasses, worksheets, short stories to practice with, and much, much more. Once again, that is storylearning.com/podkit, PODKIT. And if you're lucky, you might also find a link in the podcast description or show notes of this episode.